Okay. So, you know how people are always saying the Middle East is like complicated?
Yeah.
Well, they're not wrong. It's like one of those giant tangled up knots. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean.
And today, we are
Well,
diving right into one of the most tangled knots of them all. Israel, Hezbollah, the whole thing.
it's a tough one.
We've got this article we're looking at. It lays it all out.
Mhm.
And it's a lot. Airstrikes, guerrillas, the UN, just trying to keep everyone from completely losing it.
And it's a lot to unpack.
That's an understatement. Okay, so
yeah.
to understand what's going on right now, we got to rewind a little. Hezbollah, they haven't always been this force in Lebanon.
Right.
So, like, how did they go from a small militia to basically a major power? What's their deal?
Well, you got to go back to the 80s. During Lebanon's civil war, Hezbollah emerged then, and get this, they were funded and armed by Iran.
Iran. Okay, so they've been involved this whole time.
Yep. Iran saw them as a way to counter Israeli influence in the region. And that Iranian connection, it's key to understanding the conflict even today. It adds a whole other layer.
A whole other layer to this already very layered situation. Okay, so we've got Hezbollah backed by Iran going up against Israel. And things have been heating up lately, haven't they?
Yeah.
We're seeing those intense Israeli airstrikes on Beirut, the likes of which we haven't seen in years, right?
Definitely an escalation. But here's the thing. Israel, they're not just randomly striking targets. They're going after Hezbollah's infrastructure. Think weapons, command centers, anything that could threaten Israeli cities. It's strategic.
So instead of like a full-blown war, it's more like targeted strikes.
Exactly. They're trying to dismantle Hezbollah's capabilities piece by piece without getting bogged down in a ground war.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But Hezbollah is known for those, what are they called?
Guerrilla tactics?
Yeah, guerrilla tactics, hitting back in unexpected ways. So how does that play into all of this?
Well, that's the thing about asymmetric warfare. Hezbollah doesn't have the same firepower as Israel, but they can still cause serious damage, and they're not afraid to take risks. And it makes it really hard for Israel to completely eliminate the threat.
And then there's the whole issue of civilian casualties,
Oh.
right? It's a war zone.
It's a terrible situation.
Mm.
And there's this whole other layer of complexity because Israel claims that Hezbollah intentionally operates within civilian areas, using them as human shields. It raises a lot of questions about civilian safety and the challenges of conducting military operations in those kinds of environments.
It's tragic. And we're talking about real people caught in the middle of this. The article mentioned some heartbreaking numbers, like thousands of civilians displaced from their homes.
It's a humanitarian crisis, and it's not just the immediate danger, but the long-term consequences, too. Imagine families forced from their homes, communities torn apart, all while Lebanon is already dealing with so much instability.
So it's like one disaster on top of another.
Exactly, and this kind of displacement could easily lead to even more tension, especially between different religious groups in Lebanon.
Right, because it's not just a political conflict. There's a religious dimension to it as well.
Absolutely, and that's what makes it so volatile. You can't separate the political from the religious. It's all intertwined.
And then you've got, oh man, the UN peacekeepers. They're stuck right in the middle of it all.
UNIFIL, yeah. They're walking a tightrope, trying to maintain peace and prevent an all-out war.
But Israel is saying they should pull out.
Yeah, Israel is claiming that UNIFIL's presence actually helps Hezbollah by, well, basically getting in the way. They're saying it restricts their ability to defend themselves.
So what happens if they do withdraw? Does it make things better or worse?
That's the million-dollar question. Would it create a power vacuum that leads to even more violence, or would it give Israel more freedom to operate? It's hard to say.
Talk about a dilemma. And speaking of dilemmas, Israel's approach to this conflict, it seems like it's changed over the years.
Yeah, we're not seeing those large-scale ground invasions like we used to.
So what are they doing differently this time around?
It's all about precision. Airstrikes, special forces operations, they're relying heavily on intelligence to try and target Hezbollah's capabilities without a full-blown ground invasion.
So less boots on the ground, more like surgical strikes.
Exactly. They're trying to minimize casualties on their side and avoid getting bogged down in a war that could drag on for years.
That makes sense. But Hezbollah, they're not just going to sit back and let that happen, are they? They've got to have some way of hitting back. And they have those missiles, right?
They do. And that's where Iran comes back into the picture. They've been a major supplier of weapons to Hezbollah, including long-range missiles that can reach deep into Israel.
Okay, so things are escalating. Hezbollah is firing rockets. Israel is conducting airstrikes. What's the end game here? I mean, can either side actually win this?
That's the big question, isn't it? And honestly, it's hard to see a clear path to victory for either side. It's more complicated than that.
More complicated? How so?
It's not just a military conflict. There are so many other factors at play: politics, religion, international alliances. It's a mess, and any resolution has to address all of those factors, not just the military aspect.
You're telling me. And meanwhile, it's the people caught in the crossfire who are paying the highest price.
Exactly. It's a human tragedy.
Yeah.
And that's something we can't forget amidst all the talk of strategy and geopolitics. These are real people whose lives are being torn apart.
You're right. We can't forget that. It's easy to get caught up in all the military stuff, the airstrikes, the tactics.
Right.
But we can't forget about the human side of this. We were just talking about all those people who have been displaced, forced from their homes.
It's a full-blown humanitarian crisis. Imagine the constant fear of those airstrikes,
Yeah.
never knowing if your home is going to be next.
I can't even imagine. And it's easy to get desensitized to the numbers, Like we
Right.
hear thousands displaced, and
Yeah.
it's just a number.
But these are real people. Families, children, their lives are being shattered. And it goes beyond the immediate danger, too. Think of the long-term impact on these communities. They're already dealing with so much instability, and now this.
Yeah, and it seems like every time they start to rebuild, something else happens.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle. And this kind of displacement, it just fuels more tension, more division.
And that's what makes finding a solution so difficult, right?
Absolutely. It's not just about drawing lines on a map. You have to address the root causes of the conflict, the deep-seated resentment, the lack of trust. It's going to take a lot more than just a ceasefire.
So where will we go from here? Is there any hope for a negotiated solution, or are we looking at a conflict that could just drag on for years?
Well, there have been calls for a ceasefire from the international community, but it's really hard to see either side backing down at this point. The stakes are just too high.
Yeah, and each attack just seems to fuel the cycle of violence, making it even harder to find a way out.
Exactly. And that's what worries me the most, this constant escalation. We're talking about a region that's already on a knife's edge, and one wrong move could have disastrous consequences.
Like, everyone knows it could spiral out of control, but no one knows how to stop it.
And that's the danger of these types of conflicts. They have a way of taking on a life of their own. What starts as a border dispute can quickly escalate into something much bigger and more dangerous.
Okay, but let's say, just for argument's sake, that one side actually did manage to gain the upper hand militarily. Would that even solve anything in the long run?
It's unlikely. You see, Hezbollah has proven time and again that they're incredibly resilient. They're not going to just give up because they suffer a few setbacks. And on the other hand, a decisive victory for Israel, well, that could further destabilize the region and lead to even more violence down the line.
It's like no matter what happens, someone loses.
And that's the tragedy of it all. There's no easy solution, no clear winner.
So we're left with a lot of uncertainty, to put it mildly.
That's one way to put it. But I think it's important to remember that even in the midst of all this darkness, there are still glimmers of hope.
Like what? Give me some hope here.
Like the countless acts of courage and compassion we see every day, the aid workers risking their lives to help those in need, the families offering shelter to those who have lost their homes. Those stories don't always make the headlines, but they're a reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity shines through.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in all the bad news, but it's important to remember the good that's happening too.
Exactly. And those stories of resilience, of people coming together to help each other, they give me hope that maybe, just maybe, we can find a way out of this mess.
We have to try. Okay, so we've talked about the history, the current situation, the potential for things to escalate even further. But I think it's important to step back for a second and think about the bigger picture.
I agree.
What are the key takeaways, the things we should be thinking about as we try to make sense of all this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that this conflict is a symptom of much deeper issues. Issues that have plagued the Middle East for decades.
Like what?
We're talking about religious tensions, political instability, the fight for resources, the legacy of colonialism. All of these factors are tangled up in this conflict, and they're not going to be resolved overnight.
It's like all those things are like the fuel that keeps the fire burning.
Exactly. And until we address those underlying issues, we're likely to see more conflicts like this one erupt in the future.
So it's not just about Israel and Hezbollah.
Exactly. It's about the future of the entire region. And the decisions that are made in the coming weeks and months, they're going to have a ripple effect throughout the Middle East and beyond.
Okay, so the stakes are incredibly high. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed by it all.
It is. But it's important that we don't give in to that feeling of hopelessness, because even though the situation is incredibly complex, it's not hopeless.
So what can we do, as individuals, I mean? It's easy to feel powerless in the face of something like this.
You're right, it's easy to feel that way. But there are things we can do. We can stay informed, we can support organizations that are working to help those affected by the conflict.
Like humanitarian aid groups.
Exactly. And we can use our voices to advocate for peace.
So don't just sit there and doom scroll.
Exactly. Get involved, stay engaged, because even small actions can make a difference.
I like that. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the humanitarian crisis, the challenges of finding a peaceful resolution, the broader implications for the region. But I think we need to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the human cost of this conflict.
You're absolutely right. That's something we should never lose sight of.
It's easy to get caught up in all the politics and the military strategy, but at the end of the day, it's the people on the ground who are suffering the most.
Absolutely. And their stories deserve to be heard.
That's what I'm hoping to do in the next part of our deep dive. We're going to shift our focus from the big picture to the personal stories of those whose lives have been touched by this conflict. It's like when we talk about this conflict, it's easy to focus on the big picture stuff, the politics, the strategies, all of that.
Right.
But we can't forget about the people actually living through it, right there in the middle of it all.
Absolutely. Those are the stories that really drive it home. The human cost of this conflict, it's immeasurable. We're talking about families huddled in bomb shelters, shopkeepers who have lost everything, children who have witnessed things no child ever should.
It's just heartbreaking. It's so different from reading about it in the news.
You're right. It's one thing to hear about statistics and casualty numbers, but it's another thing entirely to hear firsthand accounts of what people are going through.
Exactly. Their stories deserve to be heard, don't they? They remind us what's really at stake.
Absolutely. They remind us that behind the headlines and the political rhetoric, there are real people whose lives have been turned upside down.
So do we have any of those firsthand accounts? Stories of what it's actually like to live in a war zone?
There's one that really stuck with me. It was from a young woman in Beirut describing the moment an airstrike hit near her apartment building. The explosion, the dust, the sheer terror she felt. It just shows how quickly life can change in a conflict zone.
Wow. That must have been terrifying for her. It's like 1 minute you're going about your day and the next minute.
Exactly. It really highlights the randomness of it all. The fact that anyone at any time could become a victim.
So it's not just about soldiers and armies, it's about everyone.
Exactly. Civilians are caught in the crossfire, often bearing the brunt of the violence.
It's just not right.
Oh.
But even in those really dark situations, there's also like incredible stories of resilience, right?
You're right, there is. I've read about this group in southern Lebanon. They're volunteers, and they risk their lives to deliver food, water, medical supplies, all of that. And they don't care what side of the conflict people are on. They just help.
That's amazing. It kind of restores your faith in humanity a little, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows that even in the midst of so much hatred and violence, there's still compassion, there's still hope.
It's good to be reminded of that. Okay, so we've covered a lot in this deep dive. The history of this conflict, the current situation, all the different factors at play.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
That's true. But I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about. One thing's for sure, this conflict is far from over, right?
Right. And it's going to continue to have ripple effects throughout the Middle East and beyond.
So what can people do? I mean, it's easy to feel helpless when you're looking at a situation like this from afar.
I think the most important thing is to stay informed. Don't turn away from the difficult news. Educate yourself about the conflict, the history, the different perspectives.
And what about all the misinformation out there?
That's a huge challenge these days. Be critical of what you see and hear. Go to reputable sources. Get your information from multiple perspectives.
Good advice. So stay informed, be critical. Anything else?
And don't underestimate the power of empathy. Put yourself in the shoes of those who are directly affected by this conflict. Try to understand their experiences, their hopes, their fears.
Because it's not just a news story, it's people's lives, right?
Exactly. And the more we can connect with that human element, the better equipped we are to advocate for peace and understanding.
That's a good point. So we're not just passive observers in all of this. We can actually make a difference.
We can all play a part, however small, in promoting peace, whether it's through education, advocacy, or simply by engaging in respectful dialogue with those who hold different views.
I like that. Well, that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Keep asking the tough questions, keep learning, and most importantly, keep caring.